Congo, circa 1960, was not a country. It was a scorched petri dish where the colonial past boiled over into a toxic vapor of geopolitics. In Leopoldville, the air carried more than just the scent of damp earth and over-roasted coffee. It reeked of the cheap gunpowder from Belgian FNFAL rifles. A heavy, clingy fog hung over the Congo River, obscuring the outlines of barges laden with copper and tin. In the bars of the European quarter, Belgian officers in starched shorts drained their last bottles of Primus beer, watching black rage simmer in the streets. For Washington and Moscow, this was more than mere decolonization. It was the Grand Gambit. Deep within the Katanga province lay uranium, the very same that fueled Little Boy as it incinerated Hiroshima. Cobalt, essential for jet engines and missile production lines, was the nervous system of modern warfare. In the hushed offices of Langley and behind the oak doors of Lubyanka, Congo was sketched as a chessboard where entire nations were the pawns. There was no room for morality here, only the dry doctrine of containment. The rules of the game were dictated by cynics in three-piece suits who knew that a single successful black operation was worth an entire division. This is the story of how idealism shattered against the steel of cold logic, and how a charismatic leader became a sacrificial lamb in a game whose rules he never quite managed to learn. Chapter 1. A Holiday Scented with Smoke. June 30, 1960. Leopoldville was suffocating under 30-degree heat and the sheer solemnity of the moment. The Palais de la Nation gleamed white, but inside, a diplomatic export of catastrophe was brewing. King Baudouin of the Belgians, a young man with sharp features and aristocratic pallor, delivered a speech about Belgium's civilizing mission. He spoke of peace, of continuity, and of the wisdom of the colonizers. Patrice Lumumba, the newly minted prime minister, sat in the front row. His narrow face, adorned with a neat goatee, looked like a frozen mask. He didn't smoke, unlike most of the attendees who favored Lucky Strikes or strong, unfiltered Belgian cigarettes. In his pocket lay the manuscript of a rebuttal that, in 15 minutes, would turn the celebration into a declaration of war. As Lumumba took the podium, a silence fell over the hall, broken only by the hum of electric fans and the distant roar of the crowds outside. "We are no longer your monkeys." Those words hit the room like a burst from a .50 caliber machine gun. Lumumba spoke of 80 years of humiliation, of forced labor, and of the racism that saturated every brick in Leopoldville. This wasn't just a political statement. It was an act of political suicide on a live broadcast. The Belgian delegation sat in a trance. King Baudouin turned so pale he looked as if he might faint. In the gallery for press and diplomats, Lawrence Devlin, the official attaché and unofficial CIA station chief, made a notation in his ledger. Devlin, a man with a piercing gaze and the manners of a university professor, realized instantly. This man was uncontrollable. And in a world divided by the Iron Curtain, uncontrollable meant dangerous. Within a week, the celebration dissolved into chaos. The army, the force publique, mutinied. Black soldiers, who had endured decades of slaps from Belgian sergeants, began settling scores. Riots broke out in Tisville and Kasai. White settlers fled for the border in a panic, abandoning their Mercedes-Benzes and half-finished whiskeys. Lumumba found himself trapped by his own victory. He needed help to restore order, but the Belgians deployed paratroopers without his consent, officially to protect their citizens, effectively to maintain a grip on the Katanga copper mines. At this moment, Moise Tshombe, the leader of Katanga, stepped into the fray, backed by the powerful mining conglomerate Union Minière. Under the protection of Belgian bayonets, he declared the province's secession. Lumumba was left without money, without an army, and without Western support. He paced the offices of Leopoldville while gunfire echoed outside. The UN sent blue helmets, but their mandate was so blurred they resembled armed tourists rather than peacekeepers. In Washington, Dwight Eisenhower looked at the intelligence briefs. For him, Lumumba was rapidly morphing into an African Fidel Castro. "If we don't stop them," Devlin told his contacts in the army staff, "there will be a Soviet base here within a month." It was then that a man who knew how to listen better than he knew how to speak took center stage. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, the young chief of staff and a former sergeant and journalist. He wore thick-rimmed glasses that gave him the air of an intellectual and always stayed slightly in Lumumba's shadow. Mobutu was a frequent visitor to the American embassy. He liked American cigarettes, the clinical clarity of Devlin's instructions, and, most importantly, the understanding that power in Africa belonged to the man with the logistics and the hard currency. Lumumba made his fatal error in mid-August. Rebuffed by the U.S. in his request for transport planes to move troops into rebellious Katanga, he sent a cable to Moscow. The response was swift. 10 Soviet IL-14 transport planes touched down at Njili Airport. Along with them came advisors and ZL-157 trucks. For Washington, this was the flare that signaled the start of a proxy war. At Langley, the analytical machinery roared to life. The diagnosis was made. Congo was infected with communism. The treatment required was radical. Devlin sat in his office, watching the ceiling fan lazily slice through the humid air. On his desk lay a decoded cable from headquarters. This wasn't about economic pressure or a diplomatic démarche. It was about the physical elimination of the Prime Minister. The operation was codenamed Barracuda. In the jungles of Katanga, mercenaries hired by the Belgians and British, veterans of the SS, the French Foreign Legion, and soldiers of fortune like Mike Hoare were already cleaning their Mausers. The scent of expensive cologne in the headquarters mingled with the stench of rotting leaves. The first domino had fallen. Chapter 2. Poison in the briefcase and whispers in the barracks. September 1960 brought a suffocating stillness to Leopoldville. A stench of rotting vegetation and cheap diesel hung over the Congo River, the scent of the Soviet ZIL-157 trucks idling at Njili Airport. Lawrence Devlin sat in his office at the American Embassy, the heavy curtains drawn tight. On his desk lay a small parcel that had arrived via diplomatic pouch. Inside was a small vial of colorless liquid and a set of toothbrushes. This was a gift from Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chief chemist, the man who ran the Laboratories of Fear under the MK-Ultra project. The poison was biological, designed to produce symptoms identical to local tropical diseases. Langley's plan was cynically simple. An agent was to infiltrate Lumumba's residence and apply the substance to his toothbrush. "Too complicated," Devlin muttered, lighting another lucky strike. "Patrice is surrounded by fanatics and Egyptian bodyguards. We don't need a laboratory. We need an army." The CIA station in Congo was operating 24/7. While Lumumba gave speeches at rallies calling for the total liberation of Africa, Devlin searched for the man who could strike from within. His gaze settled more and more frequently on Joseph Désiré Mobutu. At that time, Mobutu was the embodiment of duality. By day, he stood at Lumumba's right hand, nodding during his angry tirades against Belgian imperialists. By night, he sipped Belgian Stella Artois beer at Devlin's villa, discussing the funds required to pay the soldiers' salaries. In the chaos of a proxy war, victory isn't won with ideas, but with cash. "Patrice is chaos," Devlin said, refilling Mobutu's glass. "And chaos is bad for business. And for your future, Joseph. You don't want your officers mutinying because they can't feed their families, do you?" Mobutu remained silent, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. He was a gambler. He saw the Soviet advisors in their rumpled suits struggling to organize logistics for Lumumba, and he saw the American dollars flowing silently into the pockets of his loyal sergeants. The choice between Moscow and Washington wasn't a moral one for him. It was a matter of survival. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu made his move. It was a classic black operation disguised as restoring order. He announced the neutralization of all politicians, both President Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba. Parliament was dissolved, and Soviet diplomats were given 48 hours to leave the country. Lumumba found himself under house arrest at his residence. The building was surrounded by a double ring of troops. The inner ring consisted of his loyal soldiers and UN peacekeepers from Ghana. The outer ring was comprised of Mobutu's paratroopers, armed with Belgian FN-FAL rifles and American M1 carbines. The situation had reached a stalemate. Devlin realized that Gottlieb's poison was no longer necessary. Lumumba in isolation was more dangerous than Lumumba free. He was becoming a martyr. A new directive arrived from Langley. The target must be placed in the hands of those who have a personal score to settle with him. That meant Katanga. That meant death. In those nights, Leopoldville did not sleep. At the bars, Grand Gambit, the pioneer of Congolese rumba, performed, and the sounds of the saxophone mingled with the rumble of military Willys jeeps. Mobutu, already wearing his famous leopard-skin hat, the symbol of a chief, had finally solidified his alliance with Devlin. "He will slip away," Devlin warned during one of their secret meetings. "The blue helmets are too soft. If he reaches Stanleyville, where his support is strongest, we'll have a real civil war on our hands." Lumumba did indeed attempt to flee. On a late autumn night, under a torrential tropical downpour that muffled the sound of footsteps, he slipped out of the residence, hiding in the back seat of an old Chevrolet. He headed east toward his supporters, hoping to spark an uprising. But spotter planes were already in the sky, and roadblocks lined the paths. The Congolese mud became his enemy. The cars bogged down in the orange mire that had once been a road. On December 1st, 1960, exhausted and wearing a dirty shirt with a torn collar, Patrice Lumumba was captured by Mobutu's soldiers near the Sankuru River. When he was brought back to Leopoldville, Mobutu personally watched as his former friend was thrown into the back of a truck. The soldiers beat Lumumba with rifle butts, forcing him to eat the text of his own independence speech. It wasn't just violence, it was a ritual of desecrating a leader. In Washington, martinis were being poured. The Lumumba problem was shifting from the political crisis phase to the final solution phase. Operation Barracuda was entering its bloodiest stage. Congo was ready to swallow its first hero to feed the ambitions of those who remained. Chapter 3. The Katangan Meat Grinder, Dissolving into the Void. January 1961 greeted Patrice Lumumba not with the tropical sun, but with the cold steel of handcuffs and the metallic taste of his own blood. He was held at the Hardy military camp near Teesville, but the presence of a living prophet of revolution was corrosive to the guard's discipline. Soldiers who had sworn fealty to Mobutu only yesterday began to whisper in sympathy as they looked upon the beaten but unbroken prime minister. For Washington and Brussels, this was an alarm bell. Lumumba behind bars remained a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. The decision to transfer him to Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, the capital of rebellious Katanga, was equivalent to a death sentence. This was the domain of Moise Tshombe, a man who hated Lumumba almost as intensely as the Belgian industrialists whose profits from copper and uranium were under threat. On January 17th, an Air Congo DC-4 lifted off from the Leopoldville runway. On board, alongside Lumumba and his two associates, Okito and Mpolo, were Congolese soldiers and Belgian officers in civilian clothes. The flight, lasting several hours, was a sustained session of torture. The prisoners were beaten with such ferocity that the Swedish pilots hired for the flight later recalled the fuselage shuddering from the impact of bodies hitting the bulkheads. When the hatch opened in Elizabethville, shadows of men were shoved onto the tarmac. Lumumba could barely stand, his glasses were shattered, and his shirt was soaked in blood. A guard of honor of Katangan gendarmes, commanded by Belgian mercenaries, awaited him. "Welcome to hell, Patrice," one officer spat, crushing a Belga cigarette under his boot. They were taken to Villa Brau, a secluded house on the outskirts of the city. There, in the basement, the final stage of the Black Operation began. Moise Tshombe arrived in person. He was impeccably dressed, smelled of expensive cologne, and smoked a long cigar as he watched his arch-enemy being methodically reduced to a pulp. Belgian officers were present, Captain Julien Gat and Commissioner Franz Verschoor. They didn't just observe, they directed the process, ensuring the victim did not die too quickly. Around 10 p.m., the decision was made to finish the business. The prisoners were driven into the bush, to a desolate spot where a shallow pit had already been dug beneath a massive Mwanza tree under the glare of car headlights. Lumumba was stood before a firing squad. He made only one request, that his wife be told he was dying for his country. A volley from Belgian FAL rifles tore through the jungle silence. The bodies were dumped into the pit and covered with earth. But the following morning, the executioners were seized by panic. Rumors of the burial site began to spread. If the people found the grave, it would become a shrine for a new faith. Then, the darkest part of the plan was set in motion. Commissioner Gerard Sota and his brother received orders: destroy the evidence. Literally. They returned to the Mwanza tree armed with hacksaws, axes, and two 200-liter drums of sulfuric acid requisitioned from the nearby Union Miniere mine. Under the cover of night, choking on acid fumes and the stench of decay, they dismembered the bodies. Sota later recalled drinking whiskey straight from the bottle to keep from losing his mind. Bone, flesh, clothing, everything vanished in the hissing hell of a chemical reaction. Hours later, nothing remained of the first prime minister of an independent Congo except 2 gold teeth and a bullet, which Sota kept as souvenirs. The ash, and whatever remained undissolved, were scattered to the wind over the savannah. In Langley, Lawrence Devlin received a short, encrypted message. The target was liquidated. The threat of the Sovietization of Central Africa had been excised with surgical precision. In Washington, the new Kennedy administration was taking over, but the old methods of containment had worked flawlessly. Belgium kept its mines, the CIA kept its loyal executor in Mobutu, and Congo lost its chance at democracy before it even learned how to pronounce the word without an accent. The sun rose over Elizabethville, illuminating an empty patch of earth where, only yesterday, history had stood. Chapter 4. The Leopard in a Golden Cage, the Era of Zaire. By 1965, the political landscape of the Congo resembled a scorched prairie where only one predatory plant had survived. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, now a lieutenant general, had fully realized that in the Cold War's Game of Thrones, the winner is the one who remains useful to Washington without asking unnecessary questions. On November 24th, he executed his second and final coup. This time, there was little noise. He simply seized the radio station and announced that politicians had driven the country to the brink, and the army would take the reins for 5 years. Those 5 years stretched into 3 decades. Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku, Kuku Ingendu Wazanga. The all-people of Nodas, the great figure of the new time is the impact in 2. Mobutu Sese Seka, the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. That was now his name. He traded his European suit for the abacoste, an abbreviation of Abat le costume, down with the suit, and placed a cap of genuine leopard fur upon his head. This was more than a style. It was a black operation designed to rebrand the consciousness of an entire nation, a policy called authenticité. Leopoldville became Kinshasa, and the country itself became Zaire. But behind the curtain of African nationalism lay the most efficient kleptocracy in the history of the continent. Mobutu turned the state into a personal checkbook. While children in the Kinshasa slums of the Cité died of malaria, a Versailles in the jungle rose in Gabatalite, deep in the rainforest. It featured runways capable of handling the Concorde, which Mobutu chartered from Air France for his family's shopping trips to Paris. "We are building a barrier against communism," he would tell Lawrence Devlin, who now visited him as an old, dear friend. And Washington paid. They paid billions of dollars in IMF loans and direct military aid. Langley knew that Mobutu was embezzling up to 30% of the national budget, but he was our SOB. Under the doctrine of containment, Zaire served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for operations against pro-Soviet Angola. Through the Kamina air bases, the CIA funneled weapons to UNITA rebels, while Mobutu took his transit percentage. The infrastructure left by the Belgians began to rot. The Katanga railways, which once transported uranium for the Manhattan Project, were swallowed by vines. Termites devoured telegraph poles, but Mobutu remained unconcerned. His logic was cynical. Poor roads hindered not only trade, but also rebels attempting to march on the capital. In 1974, he hosted the Rumble in the Jungle, the greatest boxing match in history between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. He paid each participant $5 million from the treasury of a country where the average annual income was $100. It was a PR triumph. The whole world looked at Zaire through television lenses, oblivious to the torture chambers in the basements of Mobutu's residences. His regime rested on three pillars: fear, bribery, and total Western loyalty. He either bought his opponents, appointing them to ministerial posts with the right to forage, or they vanished into the waters of the Congo River. Those who tried to raise their heads, like the followers of Pierre Mulele, were destroyed with extreme cruelty, often under the supervision of foreign advisors. Devlin and his successors in the CIA station watched as their protege transformed into a caricature of a dictator. The Golden Trophy, won in 1961 at the cost of Lumumba's life, was stained with blood and corruption. But as long as the elders of the Politburo sat in Moscow and Cuban volunteers landed in Angola, Mobutu remained untouchable. He was a living monument to the victory of Operation Barracuda, the king of a destitute land whose soil continued to fuel the nuclear shield of the West. Chapter 5: Ghosts of Old Sins, a Legacy in Pixels. By the end of the 90s, the scenery of the Cold War collapsed, leaving Mobutu Sese Seko in a state of grotesque isolation. The Berlin Wall had been dismantled for souvenirs, and in Washington, a new generation of State Department clerks no longer saw the point in feeding an old leopard whose roar no longer frightened the Red Menace. In 1997, Mobutu fled the country, leaving behind not a state, but a vast black hole on the map of Africa that had swallowed billions of dollars and millions of lives. But the history of the Congo did not end there. The geopolitical logic merely shifted its scale. If in the 1960s the world fought for uranium for warheads, the 21st century saw the dawn of a new proxy war, a battle for the minerals essential to the digital revolution. The Congo, renamed the DRC, found itself the owner of the world's largest reserves of coltan and cobalt. Every smartphone in a Western pocket, every battery in a Tesla electric car, contains a fragment of that very earth where Lumumba's remains were once dissolved. Today's black operations are carried out less by intelligence agencies and more by private military companies and transnational corporations. The methods remain the same: bribing warlords, destabilizing entire provinces, and employing child labor in mines under conditions that differ little from the era of King Leopold II. The shattered infrastructure, which Mobutu deliberately left to rot, became the perfect environment for an endless cycle of violence. The absence of roads turned the eastern part of the country into a labyrinth where hundreds of armed groups wage a war of all against all for control of the pits. This is the direct consequence of the chaos sown in the 1960s during Operation Barracuda. The removal of a charismatic leader capable of national unification created a power vacuum that has never been filled by anything but greed. Lawrence Devlin, living out his days in a quiet Virginia suburb, showed no remorse in his memoirs. He had acted within the framework of expediency. But the price of that expediency has been decades of the Great African War, which has claimed more than 5 million lives. Congo today is a mirror of our world. Behind the glossy screens of high technology lies the orange dust of the Katanga mines. The jazz in Leopoldville has been replaced by the thunder of artillery in Kivu, and Belgian beer has given way to Chinese equipment at closed-off mining sites. Blood cobalt continues its journey across the planet. Patrice Lumumba, whose ashes were scattered over the savannah, has become a myth, but his prophecy came true. Africa is writing its own history, though for now, it writes it in blood upon the wreckage of machines it was never permitted to build. The old ghosts of the Cold War never truly left. They simply traded ideological slogans for stock quotes on the London Metal Exchange.